friends, and welcome back to the Culture Books podcast. My name is John, and I'm joined
by Sheridan.
Hello, Sheridan. How are you today?
I'm fabulous.
Fabulous?
Yeah.
It's been quite a lovely day here in Canberra, hasn't it?
It has.
Yes, and we've been cleaning the house. Isn't that nice?
So really only improved by starting this podcast.
At least we're having some fun now. Yes. Okay, so we're on to Chapter 2, The Hand of God, 137.
Correct. Now, can you catch us up on the story so far?
So up until the start of this chapter, so you got a war in space. Almost a Star Wars, but definitely not. I just want to quickly note, when I listened back to the podcast doing the editing and we were talking about the influences of Star Wars, I did think, we didn't mention Flash Gordon. And then one of our listeners caught me up on social media and said, you didn't say Flash Gordon. I was like, I know.
It was a fail.
So, well caught. If you are listening to this and you haven't followed us on Twitter or Facebook, the links are on the website page. So, do join up and you can let us know all the ways in which we're doing it wrong, which a wonderful number of people are already letting us know, which is really kind of them.
We should have a perfect podcast by episode 12. I
have completely missed the point of the culture, apparently. I've already been told. And part of me is like, A, there's more than one point, and B, we just haven't quite got to that yet. But
I have no idea what any of you were talking about, having only read up to chapter 2.
Anyway, so I've just blown my 30-second speed run completely out of the water with that digression. War in space. One side is losing. It's the side that's got really smart artificial intelligences. They call themselves the Culture. They're humanoid like us. And the other side is the Idirans, and they're giant, super intelligent, immortal lizards. And a changer who can... is basically a shapeshifter, has been captured and is being executed by the gerontocracy of Sorpin, and an agent of the Culture Special Circumstances has been to see him and tried to stop him getting tortured, and then a giant kaboom and the Idirans have arrived and they've rescued our protagonist, the shapeshifter, literally as the raw effluent of the gerontocracy was rising up above his nose. Boom. Okay, that's where the story was before we got to the start of this chapter. Sheridan, can you tell us what you think happened this chapter?
It was a massive chapter, I have to say. So we start outside the palace, where Horza has just escaped, and the Idiran spaceship that's called Hand of God 137 comes to rescue them. And so we start to see a few personal interactions between the characters. So once he's settled on the Hand of God, Horza and Zoralunda have quite a long, lengthy exchange.
Who's Zoralunda?
Zoralunda is the Idirian.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was introduced last chapter.
No, that was a Idiran soldier who...
sorry. So we're introduced to Zoralunda for the first time.
Who is he?
He's a Quirl.
Mm.
He is...
Spy father and warrior priest of the Four Souls tributary sect of Farnidir.
And if you couldn't tell from the title, they do tell us in the book that that's pretty much the most senior person on the ship, it seems.
Oh, very much so. Probably quite extremely senior in the whole of Idiran society.
Well, because he talks to a captain, and clearly the captain is quite low-ranking compared to Zoralunda.
Yeah.
But Zoralunda, there's quite a few sweet little exchanges between Zoralunda and Horza.
They've obviously known each other a long time.
They have. So when Horza arrives, there's a little space suit special for Horza, because he's so little compared to all of the Idirians.
But have you noticed how that's the only concession to his size? He keeps... Yeah, there's all these little bits of description, like the shower's too big and the air blasts him out, and he's a tiny little human in this ship built for giants.
So they have an exchange where we learn a little bit more about both races, for lack of a better term, and it becomes apparent that the Idirans only rescued Horza because they have a new mission for him, which is to go to Shah's world to find the mind that we were introduced to.
I completely forgot to mention the mind in my recap.
You did, in our prelude. It also becomes apparent that they have captured Belvader, and Horza and Belvader have quite a lengthy exchange about the reasons why they're fighting for each different side, because they're not members of either race.
Aren't they?
Well, Horza's not
Horza's not an Idiran.
I don't think she's a culture agent, but it seems as though the culture is actually, well, this is what maybe we'll get into in our chat, is really more of a machine.
That's Horza's view, but yeah.
All right. Anyway, we'll talk about that later. It also becomes clear that Horza wants out of the war. He comes up with a deal with Zorolanda to be paid if he completes this mission successfully. So
it's not much of a deal, though, is it?
Well, no, it doesn't.
There's literally no guarantee.
No guarantee. And then the chapter closes with the ship being attacked, presumably was attacked by the hiding culture ship, and Horza escapes or is sent off in a hyperspace. You seem to be able to fly around space just in a little suit, which...
It's kind of cool.
Yes, terrifying.
It was a neat idea, yeah.
And then it ends with, I don't know if he's about to be attacked or he's about to...
Something's found him.
Something has happened and found him.
I've noticed that we seem to get cliffhanger endings to chapters.
What some amazing narrative structure.
And
revolutionary.
It's particularly painful when we're doing this chapter by chapter, week by week structure, because you go, oh, what next? What next? What next? Like, no.
You might have to start reading them faster.
Well, we'll just have to start producing the podcast faster.
True.
Which is fine. We're having fun. Okay, so we get introduced to the first of the culture ships, which is the culture GCU of the Mountain class, and it's literally described that way at first. Now, what that stands for is a General Contact Unit. And I think you could best describe them as something equivalent to like, the Enterprise in Star Trek. It's designed to go out and meet people, but be able to fight if it has to.
Right.
That's what a General Contact Unit's...
Didn't really watch Star Trek, so...
Okay, but you got an idea of, it's a big-ish ship. And, I mean, what does saying it's from the Mountain class say to you?
It's big.
Yeah. Big, tough, and there's a description of, obviously, Zorolandra is much better informed than the captain of the ship. Because the captain's like, I'll get the gun platforms up, and then Zorolandra's like, no, we need to go now. Now.
That's true.
Leave everything behind. We got to run. And,
although when Horza is floating around in space, he says something like, I have no idea how close this ship is because now you can fight a war from thousands of light years away or however it's described.
And a beautiful line they're saying, but you still don't know why you're fighting. And
nowhere
in this chapter do they actually explain why anyone's fighting.
That's true. But it's kind of a nice analogy to modern warfare with drones.
Yeah, I mean, ICBMs did that from or even long-range bombers from the 1940s, that you could press a button and send a rocket to the other side of the world.
You couldn't win a war that way, though.
Well,
you can win a war with drones now. Well, arguably.
Yeah, but once you had nuclear weapons in intercontinental missiles, that side of things was with us. I just want to go back to a little bit right at the start of the chapter. There's quite a clever thing going on where the literal description is, first sentence, outside the palace, in the sharp cold of a winter's afternoon, the clear sky was full of what looked like glittering snow. And then it follows on in the next paragraph saying, on the sniffling breeze blew great clouds of chaff from anti-laser mortars on the palace roof. So the gerontocracy, which is backwards and relatively low tech, knows about lasers, and it's flying, blasting this reflective stuff into the air so that the lasers will reflect off it. Yeah. And it's kind of saying that's their tech level, is they know about lasers and they figured out ways to counteract them. But then we start hearing about Belvader's got a plasma gun, and obviously, and some of the Well, let's talk about the Medjol, the dogs.
I actually was a little annoyed. I forgot about them in my summary because they are clearly dogs. The Medjol are 6-legged creatures. They run around on 4 legs and have 2 little what I presume is like little T-Rex arms.
Yeah. Well, they're useful arms, so they're not quite T-Rexy, but yeah, they...
And there's this like really head bippery section where it says they're 2/3 as smart as humans.
Who are 1/3 as smart as Idirans.
Yeah. And I was like, oh my god, who's smarter? Who's the smartest?
Fractions. Well, it's saying that Medjol are almost as smart as humans and Idirans are much, much, much smarter than all of them. Idirans are... I mean, Idirans as biological creatures are going up against the artificial intelligence of the culture here, and they're winning the war so far. So, they've got to be extremely smart.
There's some pretty old school kind of dog training techniques in there though, because Zorolander kicks that poor Medjol.
I want to talk about that. Let's talk about it now. I think that's a little hint as to Zoralandra's actual character, as opposed to the bonhomie of his friendly banter with Horza, who wants something from Horza. But when he's under pressure late in the chapter and annoyed, he just kicks the dog.
Yeah, true.
And I'm sure it's written in there because kicking a dog is a sign of a bad person.
Yeah, was it in the 80s as much?
I'd say so. No one's ever liked someone who kicks the dog.
Yeah, but I felt like a bit of a whack on the nose with a newspaper was acceptable then, and it's not as acceptable now. It's like hitting your children.
I still consider a whack on the nose with the newspaper quite acceptable in the right circumstances.
A spanking was definitely acceptable in the 80s, but it is definitely not now.
Yeah, but I would say I just feel that was some little hints that Zoralandra... I mean, the guy's a very senior spy master. He's not a nice person. And that was a little bit of his true character coming out, I thought, when he kicked the Medjol.
I mean, he was literally under attack from a huge ship.
Yeah, but
trying to keep his
that's how we do things.
Changer safe so he could complete this mission, which seems very central.
Okay, well, you're forgiving of the dog kicker, but,
Well, I just wondered if it was a byproduct of its time.
I thought a really neat little Easter egg in here was the description at the start of when Horza's talking to Zoralander. So this whole chapter's kind of broken into 3 parts. There's the Horza-Zoralandra conversation, then there's the Horza-Balveda conversation, and then there's the Horza flirting through space bit.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit at the start with the last bits of him getting rescued, but that's the big parts of this one. Anyway, early in the conversation with the spy master, the line goes, Zoralandra's head went slowly from side to side between the edges of the suit collar. That's his space suit. It was a gesture Horza had never fully translated. Now, I know lizards, and when they bob their heads side to side, it's because they're tracking their prey. And I think that's what Zoralandra's doing there. And it's interesting that Horza, who we learn in this chapter, he grew up on an asteroid. That's where the changes come from. Presumably on the inside of an asteroid. Hasn't had pet lizards and just doesn't know what this head side to side thing means. It means you're food and they're thinking about eating you.
Maybe. I did like that though as well because it also demonstrates that they don't fully understand one another, but they're capable of working together. And there seems to be, whether it's real or opportunistic, a level of affection between the two of them.
They've definitely worked together for a long time and have been useful to each other. And in that sort of relationship, you're always going to have a degree of warmness. And
Horza's quite sort of... when he tries to negotiate his way out by saying, if I complete this mission, can I take my hot little minx on wherever she's from Shah's world and bugger off and live.
I thought it was a very nice thing where it wasn't saying, I will take my this woman. It was the way he said, if she's agreeable to it, even at that stage.
Ian Banks. It's all about consent, even in the 80s. We like him.
Well, everything in the culture is about consent.
But there is quite a nice moment where he's like, Horza's like, I don't know if the reason he's so dismissive of me is just because he doesn't understand how long 6 years for me is as a human, or if he doesn't care about me.
They do discuss in this chapter how the Idirans are functionally immortal due to the nature of the world that they evolved on, and how to them, there's a mention of how the idea that a thing that dies could have a soul that lives beyond them, even though they're a highly religious species, they think the idea of immortal soul is crazy because they're functionally immortal in their own bodies. Yeah. Now, what did you think of nuking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cities?
Oh, I did mean to raise that as well. It seemed very sort of quick decision and just happened, and then he double checked.
Did you nuke the cities?
You definitely nuke them. Yeah, they don't see. But then they're fighting a war.
Oh no, I get that, but I think it was written very carefully in there to be this is casual, and they used fusion bombs, which is the technology we have today. It's a hydrogen bomb. So partly this is depicting that the Idirans aren't that much more advanced than we are, because they're using a weapon that...
Or do you think it's just because Ian and Bex didn't have the...
Well, we're going to get to grid fire in this, which is a weapon from beyond reality.
See, with all that weapon stuff, I'm just like, whatever, it sounds bad.
Sure, but I think, 'cause like the way he's using the description of laser guns and anti-laser mortars, I'm pretty sure it's very deliberate. So we're just going to work through unpacking that, and you're going to have to put up with that a little bit.
Right. Before we get to that, can we talk about names?
Yes.
Because I feel like names are really important in this book.
All of them.
And they have it early in the chapter. There's a piece of text that talks about the names of the ships.
Yep.
And there's just this really cool line where Horza thought, by their names you could know them.
Yep.
And the culture names their ships quite differently to the Idirans.
Yep.
And I felt like that was quite significant. And I don't know why yet, but it seems like it's going to be significant.
Well, this whole chapter is called The Hand of God 137 because the Idirans just like to keep calling ships 137. Oh, sorry, like to keep calling ships the Hand of God.
But are there other ships called different names?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so he doesn't quite get into the weeds of the Idiran ship naming conventions, but obviously they don't mind duplication. And there is a description in here of Zoralandra saying to the captain, there have been 15 one-on-one fights between one of these light cruisers and a mountain class GCU, which does indicate an enormous war that in amongst all the fighting, 15 times 2 very particular types of ships have fought one-on-one fights, and we've lost every one of them. Which makes you think these mountain class GCUs must be quite big because this ship seems enormous. But yes, the names are super important, and the way cultures relate to the names are quite important. When Australia decided to buy a pair of what are called landing helicopter docks, and one of them's the HMAS Canberra. People are like, oh, they're just troop transports. And it's like, no, because the way we name ships in this country, for those of us, for our many international listeners, and welcome to the show, we live in Canberra, the capital city of Australia. And the first of these ships...
The capital city of Australia is not Sydney, just for everyone.
Yeah. But there have been 2 fighting ships called the Canberra before the current one, which is this a bit like the culture called a landing helicopter dock, which doesn't sound very impressive, or sounds a bit technical but not super fighty, a bit like a general contact unit. The point is we don't call troop transports after major Australian cities. We call fighting ships, and this thing has some capacity to act like an aircraft carrier, and even while they're pretending, like literally saying in every statement, oh no, it's just to carry troops around, by the name you know what it's actually for. And this happens in world navies all over the place. They just can't help themselves. In the 1970s, when the British were building a series of ships and they didn't want to build aircraft carriers because they knew that would upset people, so they built these things they called through-deck cruisers, but then they called the first one Invincible, which was letting you know what I thought it was really about. Anyway, so that's enough of me about ships. So I did think having the destroying the cities with fusion bombs, which is a reasonably close tech to what we're used to, was also quite deliberate to indicate the comparative level of technology. And also very callous, just boom, they're gone. Now, there's a discussion here about luck, which really resonated with me. Again, we're still with Zoralandra and Horza, because there's a lot of really improbable coincidences going on here. Horza's literally got effluent under his nostrils when the Idirans turn up to rescue him. Improbable timing. There's something that the Idirans want on the surface of Shah's world, which is the escaped culture mind. And they've got Horza, who is one of, a handful of living beings in the entire galaxy who has actually lived on Shah's world.
Well, there's even also just the mind escaping in the prelude.
Yes.
The way it did.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a lot of improbable coincidences going on. And, Zoralandra says, you were more than a little lucky yourself to Horza. And Horza replies, yes, but the difference is that I believe in it.
But that's because the Idirans are religious, and a lot of religious people don't believe in luck because they think it's God's will. Sure,
but Horza's faith structure obviously does include luck.
Yeah, because he doesn't believe in... Well, it's a little unknown at the moment, but he doesn't seem to believe...
He doesn't believe in the Idiran.
He definitely doesn't believe in the Idiran god.
Mm.
But it's a bit unclear whether he believes in any god.
But he has lived, and we're getting into... Yeah, let's talk about the Sublimed, because the Dra Azon, who control Shah's world, are part of Ian Banks' idea that once a society has lived in the galaxy long enough and are powerful enough and advanced enough, they sublime to a higher plane of reality. They just don't want to hang around in this universe, and they've figured out a way to get to a cooler one. Right. And the Dra Azon are part of...
Yeah, but I don't know that yet. Cause...
It's starting to get danced around here.
Is that like the minds as well?
Well, no, minds are just artificial intelligences in this universe.
But the mind seems to be running the culture.
The minds are running the culture, but they're still doing it in the universe that we live in.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But Horza has lived directly under the influence of the Dras on the godlike beyond.
Well, they're very
creatures.
Elusive to me at the moment. They're just really a name.
They're meant to be, yeah. But he does talk about them in particular when they talk about how the Idirans have tried to use a warp animal to sneak into Shah's world.
Oh yeah, true. And they couldn't get through.
Well,
and Horza was like, yeah, as if it would have.
Well, and I like the way Zoralandra gets quite defensive, and he's like, they tried their best.
Yeah.
Which, because, we're sort of given the idea of these giant space lizards as Nazis in space, or religious fundamentalists in space. But that's quite an understanding and forgiving view. It's like, yeah, they failed, but they were doing their best. I've known plenty of humans who don't have that level of understanding of other people's failures.
Well, and there's relevantly to another conversation later with Belvader about empathy, which is what you're kind of talking about.
Yeah, and she rejects empathy.
Mm.
That's interesting. Yeah. Also, in this passage, we get up to where Horza starts talking about what he's going to want for doing this. Yeah, if I can get this metaphysical computer for you. And then Zoralandra, something in your voice tells me we approach the question of remuneration, which is one of the most cited quotes from all.
Well, and actually, now that I think about it, I do now that actually on reflection now, I think maybe the Idirans are going to screw him over, because Horza, when he said, "Oh, I don't know if he's just doesn't want to pay me because he doesn't realize how long 6 years is for a human."
Hmm.
Clearly, Horza. Zoralandra, when he starts the combo, was like, oh, great, this humanoid's going to ask me to pay him.
Mm.
And so, maybe he is just taking advantage of him.
I do think, Zoralandra did say this would be a intelligence coup beyond price if we captured a culture mind.
Mm.
Particularly, this is meant to be a new and more advanced culture mind. So compared to running one weird little human and catching this, why not let them free? Why not get a reputation that you pay well?
True.
So but the Idirans view themselves as significant. We're going to get to it, just how far above they view themselves over, frail humans.
Can I just say,
Yep.
So I have been reading the books, obviously, but I have also been listening to the Audible book.
Yes.
Reading.
Wow.
Just because there's a lot of names. And
So we're doing this full spectrum. We've got the Kindle versions, we've got print versions, we've got the audio versions.
So the reason why I just raised it in this context is because when you read the chapters, I was like kind of loving the Idirans. Like I was like, they're cool. But when the Audible book comes on, which is narrated by Peter Kenny, they are voiced with a very heavy Russian or some sort of Baltic accent, which me as a Anglo-Saxon person has been taught my entire life they are the evil people.
Right.
And so they do take on this kind of evil tone.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, they're a combination here. I mean, the idea that they're very literal in naming their things and they've got a ship that's Hand of God 137. I certainly remember in the 90s there was a lot of mocking of the Chinese that instead of giving a nice name to, a building, they'd call it, Industrial Plant 25. So there's a bit of that, and there probably is a bit of, the Western fear of the Soviets. And remember, this book was written while the Cold War was still a thing.
True. Yeah. I'd just be interested to know what decisions go into actually the narration of books on Audible.
I was actually curious, does the audiobook have sound effects or is it just a straight narration?
It's just a straight narration.
Okay. Interesting.
But
you'd be halfway to making a movie if you started putting sound effects
definitely though. I don't really listen to a lot of fiction usually on Audible. I mostly listen to non-fiction.
Yep.
And so hearing a dude try and do a woman's voice it's pretty sort of theatrical in its presentation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Gridfire gets mentioned for the first time.
Oh, sorry. I did realise we needed enough time for you to talk about this because you're itching for it, I can tell.
That's all right. I am as flicking through the chapter and going through the bits I've highlighted, and obviously you're free to do the same. Gridfire gets mentioned, and it's going to come back later. And, there's risk of being a little spoily. This is describing, because we've had, lasers and plasma, which we understand as humans in 2021. And fusion bombs we know about. And antimatter we can theorize, but we don't know. And antimatter bombs are in these books later. But then it's just this casual mention of gridfire, which is something beyond what we can understand, which is the idea that, at a certain level of dimensions, there's this grid that separates different universes from each other. And when you use gridfire, you're tapping into this boundary between universes. So that, this is moving beyond, laser beams, which, humans can make laser beams, but they don't make great weapons yet because we don't have enough power to make them work. So that's in there, and it's a bit of a Chekhov's gun. We're going to find more about that later.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'm really not in it for the military tactics, though. I'm probably more in it for this.
Well, that's how we can enjoy this at different levels, yeah. I did think it was significant how, the auto galley was making food that tastes awful and the water was, the idea of uninspiring water makes you wonder what sort of residual tastes are in it.
But obviously, maybe the Idirans don't drink water.
I think it might just be more that they just do not care about Horza's comfort.
Well, they seem to have tried because they made something that looked like human food, but then didn't taste like it.
Yeah, to me it felt like a lot of things, they're just making minimum efforts. Yeah, it's like, this will keep him alive, that's all we care about.
But if you're just trying to keep him alive, wouldn't you just give him, the slop? You wouldn't try and present it like it's appealing.
Yeah.
So it's more I felt it was more like a lack of understanding about what food was about for the humanoid.
Could be.
But then this was before I listened to the Russian interpretation, and then I was like, oh my god, they're evil.
Now, we get some description of the inside of the ship when... So, one thing I kind of like is how at the end of Horza's conversation with Zaralandra, Zoralandra's like, oh, you can go visit your little friend Balvader if you want.
Yeah, which again was a bit like, oh, the humans can talk to each other.
Well, we'll give him a treat.
How cute are they?
We'll give him a treat.
Fetch doggy.
I did like how he said, oh, you should go visit her before we torture her.
Yeah, true. She seems pretty chill, though, given the precarious situation she's in.
She does, yeah.
Which makes me think she definitely knows something, because she's constantly saying the culture's going to win, despite the fact they're losing. So she's either completely drank the Kool-Aid or she knows something more. And I felt like she knows something, that they have some sort of secret weapon that we don't know about.
Ooh, okay. Now, this is kind of where we shift from the Zoralandra Horza conversation, so I think this is a good point for us to discuss the whiskey we're drinking.
Oh, so we decided that we would drink whiskey because Ian Banks is Scottish.
And a whiskey writer.
He
wrote a whole book called Raw Spirit about the Scottish... I think it was the Scottish Whisky Association paid him a fortune to write them a book about his search for the perfect dram of Scotch.
Oh, really? Is it like literary fiction?
That's just a book about Scotch.
Oh, because my only experience with Ian M. Banks before studying this was I read The Wasp Factory.
Oh, right.
Which I thought was actually a very good book. And I was kind of disappointed when you told me that he basically realised there was no money in science fiction. And so he wrote literary fiction.
No, it wasn't that. It was that he couldn't get published in science fiction.
Yeah.
So he wrote literary fiction as the easy publishing option.
It's quite sort of bizarre to think about that.
Okay, so what are we are drinking? It's called the Six Isles. It is a blended malt Scott whiskey by Voyager. And it contains blend whiskies from Orkney, Skye, Mull.
I've been to Orkney.
Wow, that is a long way up than the north end of...
is one of the most amazing places that I've ever been in my entire life, and I desperately want to go to the Shetland Islands after being there.
Cool. Okay, so we've got Orkney malt in this. We've got Skye, Mull, Jura, Arran, and Isla. And Mr. Banks certainly felt that Isla malt was the... absolute best Scotch, and actually so do I. But we've got this blended one. Sheridan, now what we're going to do, we're not going to drink a new bottle of whiskey every week because...
We'll be broke and drunk.
We can't afford it. But what we will do is buy a bottle of whiskey and drink it while we do the podcast, and so when we get to the end of the bottle, we'll talk about our thoughts on it then and start a new one.
Or we might... I don't know. I feel like maybe we could just buy new bottles and just switch it up.
Okay, alright, so this will be an evolving segment. We're not quite sure how it's going to work out. But at the moment we have this, the Six Isles blended malt Scotch, which was only $65 at our local Dan Murphy's, which is probably 30% more than the cheapest whiskey out there, so it's still pretty cheap.
It's tasty. I'm not really a whiskey drinker.
We are drinking from the crystal... whiskey glasses that your friend gave you for your 40th birthday.
We are. I'm very appreciative of them.
Yep. Now we've added a little bit of water.
Well, we added an ice cube.
Oh, don't tell them that.
Why? It's really hot here.
Scotch drinkers won't understand. Anyway, I actually have done a lot of science and research on this, and there's a lot to say that a single, very small ice cube is actually the best way to go. Scottish people will still throw their hands up in the air and scream at us. And I've noticed in our download statistics, there's a bunch of Scottish people keeping an ay on what we're doing.
Well, they are going to blow their minds when they hear that Queenslanders put their red wine in the fridge.
Well, they don't know about red wine. Anyway, so we have added a single ice cube, which is melted out by now. Adding some water to Scotch does the water opens up the ester chains and gives you the full range of smells and flavours. So tell me what you're thinking about the Six Isles, Sheridan.
It's quite smooth.
Mm-hmm.
Bit of a smoky aroma.
Island...
I think it's quite easy drinking.
Island whiskey should always have a bunch of smoke. It's incredibly lightly coloured. It's like the lightest of straw, which for Isla can be often dark with all the smoke and the peat. But it's got a fair bit of smoke in the flavour. And I would say for a $65 bottle of scotch, this might be the best $65 bottle of scotch I have ever bought.
I'd go back for more.
Wow, okay. And you're not even a scotch drinker?
No.
All right. Okay, so Sheridan, we get a description of the inside of the warship. What do you think it's like?
Well, I don't actually really understand because at one point they say it's soft. So it sounds like you're in one of those like trampoline worlds.
I felt like it was the inside of a lizard terrarium. The idea that it's all red and very humid. You can't see too far. So that was I got that. And then a bunch of Idirans go past Horza and ignore him. And little description here, Idirans hated to appear either over-inquisitive or under-informed.
Which are kind of, obviously two sides of the same coin, but...
Yeah. Yeah, a little cultural giveaway there. And then he notices that the wounded Medgels have what's described the spiral splatter marks on their battle armour were unmistakably those produced by a plasma bolt.
I didn't quite pick that up because that's Belvader's...
memory form.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, we'll get to that. But then he says the gerontocracy didn't have any plasma weapons, so it's this idea there's this hierarchy of weapons, and you're getting a sense of where people sit in these things by what they've got. But the Idiran guard was holding a laser carbine, so Belvader's got this. We discover has this plasma weapon, but the Idirans are still just using laser guns.
Well, she seems to have something cooler than a plasma weapon. She's got a pendant that turns itself into any freaking weapon she wants.
Well, I don't know about any weapon, but
it says amongst other things.
Yeah, she says amongst other things. Yeah,
although that could just be her.
It could, but the idea that a memory she's got a little pendant around her neck, and suddenly it can boom turn into this super scary gun. Yeah. And a beautiful, because there is this description right at the start of the chapter of something going kaboom in the gerontocracy's keep, and then when Horza is talking to Belvader, he says, "Oh, I heard your knife missile took the expansive way out," as in it exploded itself. But yeah, a nice little line saying, "Oh, a memory form. Wouldn't have turned into a plasma gun by any chance." Oh, amongst other things. And then a key line here where Horza says, "I don't suppose you'd be here if you had anything important you could tell them, would you?" And she's like, "Well, here maybe, but alive no." And yeah, anyway, we'll get to more about what culture people can do with their bodies. But yeah, she's got this definite sense that they could not capture me alive.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they start discussing not even why they're fighting, because they never get to exactly why they're fighting.
They talk about why they've chosen, what sides they've chosen.
Yeah. And why they haven't stopped fighting, I guess. And, I like this line of Horza's asking Belvader, did life in your great utopia really get so boring you needed a war?
Yeah.
And there's this thing they talk about how everyone in the culture had a vote. And they voted that they were going to go to war with the Idirans. And, part of my brain as someone who does elections for a living is like, well, how many minds are there versus how many humans? How was the voting distributed? Because, you can, let's say an artificial intelligence runs a little bit like a computer program. You could spawn out, many trillions of them if you needed them to count in your voting. But that's just me.
Yeah, well, there's also a similarly important section where Horza says, "I'm not with the Idirans. I'm just against you," which is, a lot of people vote that way. People vote because they just don't want the other side.
Yeah.
It's not like, they believe in Labour or Liberal or Democrat or Republican. They just don't want the other.
Yeah, and they vote for something that's totally against their own interests just because their own hatreds. Yeah.
Yeah. It was quite sort of political in that sense.
And we get the little reveal that the changes come from an asteroid where Belvader... I don't quite understand the significance of this. She says, "I don't understand why you're fighting. I know Hydahor is in, and he says, Hebehor. So correcting her pronunciation, just one letter, which is italicized, and Ian Banks does not use italics often, so I feel like when he does, we should pay attention. But
I wouldn't say it's completely unknown in the text to use italics.
there's okay, I can see one other point on this page, and there's one earlier in the chapter.
We wouldn't want it more than once or twice a chapter. To be
Yeah.
But that was just so that the reader knows the difference, could determine the difference between the D and the B.
Sure. And,
but obviously, but I felt like all that signified was that she doesn't really have a deep understanding about where he's from.
Or she's trying to fool him that she doesn't understand it.
Maybe.
Because she's pretty sneaky. Anyway, and it also tells us that in this huge galactic conflict, the changes come from one tiny little asteroid.
Yeah.
And so
they're obviously not many, because there's not many of them left. They've already said that.
They have, but one tiny little asteroid, that's where they're from.
So I want to talk though about the mines and what comes out in this conversation with Balbeda and Horza. Because at one point he says, you're ruled by your machines. Yep. You're an evolutionary dead end.
Yep.
So I get this sense that the culture has itself a hierarchy and the machines are at the top of it. Yes. And so that means Balbeda is similar to Horza in that she's just chosen a side because she's not of...
But she's a cultural citizen, so in theory she had a vote in the decision to go to war.
Well, then that made me sort of think that this is this... I was like, oh my God, are the mines like the deep state? Like, is this...
Oh, the mines are definitely the deep state. But you even have, and they discuss this a lot in this passage of how special circumstances... Well, contact becomes the military because they've got the hardware to go out and interface with other societies and... they meddle in other societies, and then special circumstances are the black ops guys.
They're like the CIA, right?
It's a rough analogy in that special circumstances, and they talk a lot in this chapter about what they are and what they think, and how no thoughts are forbidden, and we have to tackle everything. But sometimes when you're dealing with really tricky stuff, you have a choice. It's the trolley car dilemma. Do you actively kill one person to save 5 lives? It's basically that scaled back up, and a willingness to take a life to possibly save countless others, but then you're in the realm of a definite death versus a hypothetical salvation.
Well, they're also like this. I mean, that's why I use the CIA analogy. Is they're like this necessary evil in that they're not particularly highly regarded within their own society, but they're seen as being needed.
I think the CIA is, particularly in conservative parts of American society, really highly regarded. I mean, American Dad is, and we've literally got a cat named after Roger.
American Dad is literally a piss take on the CIA and why they're so shit.
Yeah, but lots of people say, oh, he's the square-jawed family man. It cuts both ways.
Yeah.
Lots of people don't take that with the irony it's intended.
Wow. Wow, that when I want to meet one of those people and have a convo and a beer with them.
Oh, okay.
That will blow my mind.
I can introduce you to them. Anyway, and we get to your quote. Your quote.
We do get to my quote.
From the first episode. Empathise with stupidity and you're halfway to thinking like an idiot. Now,
I really like that quote, and I liked it even more when I actually read it in this context, because I hadn't read it in the context when I chose it.
But interestingly, it's Balbeda who says that. She's from the side with the super intelligent artificial intelligences. And she's like, well, stupid people. Why would you bother?
Yeah. I feel like, though, this whole time, though, she knows that they have something that is going to make them win.
Well, I think we even get to...
Well, she says, I'm not giving away anything, but we're going to win.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of this whole book is the comparison to World War II when the Japanese attacked the USA. And yes, for the first couple of years, they ran riot, and they won lots of victories. And they were like, hooray, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. And meanwhile, the US was pulling back to Hawaii because they didn't have any choice because they were losing. And building an enormous number of ships that they were then going to use to smash the Japanese. And that allegory is thick, and Ian M. Banks was entirely using that analogy. So that's a big part of what's going on here, that the Idirans are like the Japanese going, whoa, we're all warlike people, and with their initial onslaught, they're successful, and, Belvader's like, oh, you have got no idea what's coming at you. But I know what's coming at you, and it's not even a secret what's coming at you. So that's what's going on there. And there's a nice bit in here where, Horza responds, if you want to know about winning, ask the Idirans. And then she's like, oh, we know there's a danger in war, you start to resemble the enemy. And that's in any, conflict, you study your enemy and you adopt their tactics when they're useful, and you do run that risk. And then there's a lot of introspection on special circumstances, which again, you get into that CIA comparison, that's very real. There's a nice description of the culture here, where Horza was thinking, well, in a society which clung to its absolutes, life versus good, death versus bad, pleasure versus good, pain versus bad, and people criticize this liberal ideal that we just want to, live and enjoy pleasure and not experience pain. I don't know. I think we should, tick those boxes before we worry about other things.
Well, maybe. I don't know. The Buddhists probably disagree.
Oh, really?
Well, they say life is suffering.
So the big reveal is that they've known that there's this culture general contact unit lurking somewhere around through the whole chapter, and they keep mentioning it and then ignoring it. And then suddenly, Horza has left Belvader's cell, and Zorolandros comes rushing up saying, I need to get you out of here. And the culture craft was hiding in the surface layers of the system sun. In the sun! Horza was incredulous. He looked back at the cell door as though it was Belvader's fault. Those bastards are getting smarter all the time. So the idea that this culture ship had hidden itself it could just go inside the sun without burning up.
Well, and clearly they're getting smarter, because it could, in the prelude, could avoid this sort of asteroid explosion thing.
Yeah. But and this is where it's getting, their technology is actually much greater than the Idirans have
realised.
And are ready for. And then we get the big line where Horza gets pushed into the airlock, and he's got his spacesuit on, and he's given a warp unit which plugs into his spacesuit and just launches him out into faster than light travel into the universe. But the line, you could smash and destroy from unthinkable distances, obliterate planets from beyond their own system, and provoke stars into nova from light years off, and still have no good idea why you were really fighting. And the irony is, in this whole chapter, we've never actually got to why they're fighting. There's a quick mention of how he's floating out in the void, thinking about Zorolandra, and the time that Zorolandra made him say a prayer before they went into warp space. And the description is, only the behaviour of devotion was required. His heart and mind were of no consequence. Which comes to how I don't think Zorolandra actually views Horza as any sort of equal or even a human. He just wants the dog to sit before dinner.
Yeah, but that's also, though, don't you think, I entertain the grace at your parents' house every week, and I'm not doing it, but I feel like it's the act of, having to pretend, not pretend, but just display...
Observing the manners of the household.
Yeah. That's all I felt like that was.
Yeah.
I mean, he sees himself obviously as a superior being to Horza.
Yeah. And then just as it closes, literally on the last page, there's a description of how the war's going. The early reverses and first few megadeaths had not, as the pundits and experts had predicted, which indicates that the galaxy's got all these observers writing blog posts about it, shocked the culture into retiring, horrified at the brutalities of war, but proud to have put its collective life where usually only its collective mouth was. Instead, it had just kept on retreating and retreating, preparing, gearing up, and planning. Which gets to the comparison between the US and Japan in 1942.
Yeah, I didn't pick that up.
Sorry, just a last quote as we go. And again, this is Horza's interior narrative. The fools in the culture couldn't see that one day the minds would start thinking how wasteful and inefficient the humans in the culture themselves were. Which is the idea that the minds are just keeping people as pets.
Yeah, which is what I've been saying. Like, the minds are controlling the culture.
Yes. Is that a bad thing?
Well, I think it's probably pretty crap for Belveda.
Why is it crap for her?
Well, she's going to get screwed over by them at some point.
Okay, interesting. And then just at the very end of the chapter, Horza's floating in space in his spacesuit, and he's run out of warp unit, and something's coming in. All right. Well, this has been a super long episode. It was a long chapter, so that's good.
It was a good chapter.
I hope you've enjoyed it, folks listening. Thank you so much for listening. It's been really heartening, the number of people who've signed up to the podcast.
It's really awesome.
Apparently we've hit 150-something, or 145 in the Australian Arts and Books podcast charts already. Which I think says more about Australia's lack of interest in arts and books. For which we apologise. But anyway, thanks folks, and we'll be back as soon as we've read the next chapter and ready to talk to you.
Thanks, folks.
Bye.